She was just a kid in seat 17A until the F-22 pilots heard the name Falcon. It was just another ordinary flight for Emily, the 12-year-old girl in seat 17A. Her parents had separated when she was much younger, and today, like many times before, she was on her way to visit her dad. He lived on a military base, and she rarely got to see him. But today was different. She was flying alone, which felt like a big adventure to her. The plane was mostly quiet, with the hum of the engines and the soft chatter of the other passengers. Emily liked to sit by the window where she could watch the world below. The clouds rolled lazily past as the plane climbed higher into the sky. She didn't mind flying. It gave her time to think. She stared out the window, letting her mind wander. She thought about her dad, the man she admired so much, the man who was always busy with work and travel. It wasn't easy being the daughter of a man in the Air Force. She didn't always understand what he did, but she was proud of him. Sometimes she wished he could be home more often, but she knew his job was important. She had no idea, though, that this flight would change everything. To the other passengers, she was just another kid traveling alone, quietly lost in her thoughts. They probably didn't even notice her, but Emily didn't mind. She liked being unnoticed. Being invisible, she thought, was sometimes the best way to be. The flight attendant, a young woman with a bright smile, passed by Emily's seat. "Can I get you something to drink, sweetie?" she asked politely. Emily looked up from her window and nodded. "Just water, please," she said quietly. The flight attendant smiled again and moved on. Emily turned back to her window, watching the world below slowly shrinking into a patchwork of green fields and small towns. The turbulence was light, but it didn't bother her. She was used to it. She had been flying ever since she could remember. It was always the same, long hours spent in the air, sitting in silence, wondering what her father was up to on the ground. She thought about the stories her father told her when he came home. Stories of flying high above the clouds in jets, of secret missions and daring escapes. Her dad, she knew, was a hero in his own way, but he never talked too much about the details. He'd always smile, ruffle her hair, and change the subject when she asked about his work. She never pressed him, though. She knew there were things he couldn't share with her. "Falcon," Emily muttered to herself, almost to no one. That was her father's call sign. She had heard it so many times that it had become part of her world. Falcon was what people called him in the Air Force. It was his name on missions, in the cockpit of fighter jets, and in the quiet radio chatter that only a select few would ever hear. She loved the way it sounded, strong and steady, just like her father. The plane banked slightly as it turned, and Emily shifted in her seat. She had always wanted to learn more about flying, but her dad had always told her that being in the cockpit wasn't as glamorous as it sounded. "It's hard work, kid," he'd say, "and it's dangerous. You don't want to be in my shoes." But Emily had never been afraid of danger. She loved the idea of being brave, of doing something important. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew she wanted to follow in her dad's footsteps. Maybe not in the exact same way, but in some way that made her proud. She dreamed of flying, of racing through the sky like the pilots her dad worked with. But for now, she was just a kid in seat 17A, quietly waiting for the flight to reach its destination. Emily didn't notice the two men in the row behind her, one of whom had been listening carefully when she said the word, Falcon. They weren't sitting close enough to be in her line of sight, but they were close enough to overhear her mutter the name under her breath. The older of the two men turned to his companion, his expression unreadable. "You heard that?" he asked softly. "Yeah," the other man replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Falcon, that's the call sign of Colonel Thomas, right?" The first man nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Could be, but what's a kid like her doing with that name? She doesn't look like a military kid." The second man looked back at the young girl in seat 17A who was still lost in her thoughts, unaware of the quiet conversation behind her. "Maybe we should talk to her, see if she knows anything." "No," the first man said, shaking his head. "Not yet. We need to be careful. If she's just some kid, we could make things worse." They both fell silent, their attention still on the girl in the seat ahead of them. Neither man had any idea that Emily's mention of the name, Falcon, would set off a chain of events that neither of them was prepared for. Meanwhile, Emily remained completely unaware of the men behind her or their sudden interest in her. She continued to gaze out the window, her thoughts far away. She thought about her father again, wondering where he was now, what he was doing, and whether he was thinking of her. She missed him and she wished she could be with him more. The thought of him being out there, flying in the sky, gave her comfort. She knew he was always safe, even though he couldn't always be home. The flight attendants walked down the aisles, making sure everyone was settled. Emily barely noticed them, too deep in her thoughts. She heard the faint click of a seatbelt sign turning on as the captain made a brief announcement about the expected weather. It was all so routine, so normal, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, something unusual happened. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the quiet monotony of the flight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we may experience a slight bit of turbulence. Please remain in your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Emily glanced at the seatbelt sign above her, but it wasn't necessary. She was already buckled in. She glanced back out the window, watching the clouds shift and change. The turbulence wasn't bad, but the plane shook slightly, making the air feel more tense. She could feel it even though she wasn't scared. In the distance, the pilots, having overheard the name Falcon, began to wonder just how deep Emily's connection to her father really went. Was it just a coincidence, or was there more to the story? But Emily, still gazing out the window, had no idea that her simple mention of a name would soon turn her life upside down. The plane shook slightly as the turbulence picked up. Emily's fingers tightened around the armrests, but she wasn't afraid. Flying had always felt natural to her, even though some people seemed to get nervous when the plane hit bumps in the air. She was used to it. It wasn't her first time flying alone, and it probably wouldn't be her last. Her eyes wandered out the window again. The clouds were thickening now, covering the blue sky in shades of white and gray. She loved the way the sky changed, how one moment it could be so clear and the next, it could turn into something entirely different. The world from the sky seemed so vast, so endless, and Emily often thought about how small she was in comparison. She started daydreaming about what it would be like to be a pilot. What would it feel like to fly through those clouds? What did her dad feel when he was up in the air, piloting the fighter jets? She often asked him about flying, but he never went into much detail. It was like there was always a piece of his world he couldn't share with her. That made Emily both curious and a little frustrated. "Hey, sweetie, are you okay?" The flight attendant's voice interrupted her thoughts. Emily looked up to see the young woman standing in the aisle, her hand resting on the back of the seat in front of Emily. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Just looking out the window," Emily said with a shy smile. The flight attendant smiled back. "Just making sure. The turbulence can be a little scary, especially for first-time flyers. Let me know if you need anything." "I will," Emily replied, giving her a small nod. As the flight attendant moved on, Emily returned to watching the clouds. She could feel the plane swaying with the movement of the wind, but it wasn't anything too bad. It felt like a mild roller coaster ride, just enough to make her stomach flip a little. She didn't mind it, though. It was part of the adventure, she thought. In the back of the plane, the two pilots were having a hushed conversation, their eyes darting to Emily every so often. They had been listening carefully to the young girl's words, particularly when she casually mentioned the name Falcon. To them, it wasn't just a name. It was a call sign, one they recognized well. It was the call sign of a highly respected officer in the Air Force, someone they had worked with in the past. Someone who had earned his reputation as Falcon because of his skill, his bravery, and his dedication to his country. The name had sparked their curiosity. They hadn't intended to eavesdrop on the young girl, but the mention of Falcon was too much to ignore. The pilots exchanged knowing looks, their minds racing as they pieced together the possibility that Emily's father was the very same Falcon they had worked alongside. The chance of it being just a coincidence seemed slim, but they weren't sure how to approach the situation. "Do you think we should say something to her?" one pilot whispered. "I don't know," the other pilot replied. "If she's really his daughter, it could be dangerous. What if someone knows about her and is tracking her? We don't know what kind of danger she could be in." They fell silent, contemplating the situation. They had both seen things in their careers that made them cautious. The military world was full of secrets, and the last thing they wanted to do was make a mistake. They knew that the information Emily had casually mentioned could lead to bigger problems if it fell into the wrong hands. As the plane cruised through the skies, the tension between the two pilots grew. They decided it was best to inform their superiors as a precaution. One of them grabbed the phone in the seat pocket in front of him, quietly dialing into the military communication system. The message was simple but urgent. "We've encountered a potential security concern. A young girl on board just mentioned the name Falcon. We need to check this out. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Emily was still lost in her thoughts. She noticed that the turbulence was starting to settle down and the plane felt smoother again. Her attention drifted back to her dad. She wondered what he would think of her flying alone. Would he be proud of her or would he worry? She had always looked up to him, admired the way he carried himself, the way he made everything look so easy. But what she didn't know was that her mention of Falcon had already set something in motion, something that would soon change her life forever. The pilots had already contacted their superiors, and within minutes, a plan was being put into place. The captain came over the intercom, his voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to experience a slight detour in our route due to some unexpected air traffic. Please remain in your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We will update you if anything changes." Emily glanced up at the seatbelt sign, which had lit up. She quickly buckled herself in, but she didn't feel anxious. She was used to these small changes in the flight plan. It wasn't uncommon for planes to adjust their routes in midair. But for the pilots, things were becoming more serious. They had informed their superiors, who now suspected that something larger was happening. The security of the entire flight could be at risk, and they needed to be prepared for whatever might happen when they landed. As Emily sat quietly in her seat, unaware of the escalating situation around her, the two pilots decided to approach her. They were still hesitant, but felt a responsibility to protect her if she was indeed connected to Falcon. One of the pilots stood up and walked down the aisle. He made his way to Emily's row, his footsteps steady but cautious. He stopped just behind her and cleared his throat softly. Emily turned to look at him, surprised to see one of the pilots standing in the aisle. "Hello there," he said, offering a warm smile. "My name's Captain Harris. I noticed you're interested in flying. I'm a pilot myself, and I thought you might like to chat for a minute. It's not every day we meet someone who's so curious about aviation." Emily blinked, a little confused by his sudden attention. She hadn't expected any of the flight crew to approach her. Sure," she replied, her voice quiet but polite. Captain Harris lowered his voice, trying to sound casual but with a hint of curiosity. "I overheard you mention Falcon earlier. That's an interesting name. I know someone who goes by that call sign. Do you know who that is?" Emily's face flushed slightly, a little embarrassed that she had mentioned it. "Oh, it's just my dad's call sign," she said quickly. "He's a pilot in the Air Force. I don't really know much about it. He doesn't talk about his work much." Captain Harris smiled again, but this time his eyes seemed to narrow just slightly. "That's interesting," he said. "Does your dad ever tell you stories about his flying? I bet it's pretty exciting work, isn't it?" Emily shrugged, her face lighting up a little. "Yeah, I guess it is. He's always flying, going on missions. Sometimes he's gone for a long time, but he never really talks about what he does. It's all secret stuff, I think." Captain Harris exchanged a quick glance with the other pilot, who was standing a few rows back, listening in. He nodded slightly, signaling that the conversation was going as they had expected. But there was no real way of knowing just how far this story would go. "Thank you for chatting with me, Emily," Captain Harris said, turning to leave. "Just remember, if you ever need anything, I'm right here." He smiled and walked back down the aisle, his mind racing with the possibilities of what they might need to do next. Emily sat back in her seat, still unsure of what to make of the conversation. The pilot's questions felt a little strange, but she didn't think much of it. She was just a kid, and maybe he was just trying to be friendly. What she didn't realize was that the name Falcon had already set in motion, a chain of events that would soon involve people far beyond the cabin of this plane. The journey was just beginning, and Emily's world would never be the same. Emily sat quietly in her seat, her eyes once again glued to the window as the clouds passed by. She could feel the subtle hum of the plane beneath her, but the noise felt strangely comforting. She had always loved the feeling of being in the sky, away from the noise and chaos of the world below. To her, there was something peaceful about the endless blue stretching out in all directions. It made her feel like nothing could touch her. But today, everything felt different. The conversation with the pilot, Captain Harris, had left her with more questions than answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Why had he been so interested in her mentioning her father's call sign, Falcon? It wasn't the first time she had mentioned it, and it wasn't a secret. At least, she didn't think it was. Emily turned her attention back to her lap, where the small picture of her dad, taken during one of his rare visits home, lay tucked in the pocket of the seat in front of her. She had always been proud of him, even though she didn't understand much about his work. He had always told her that his job was special and that it was something important, but he never went into detail. The name Falcon had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. It was her dad's call sign in the Air Force, something that sounded so cool to her, like a superhero name. She often imagined her dad flying a fighter jet, zooming through the sky, faster than anyone else, doing missions that no one else could do. She had always admired him for his strength and bravery, but as she got older, she realized that she didn't know nearly as much about his work as she thought. The pilot's reaction to her mention of Falcon kept replaying in her mind. There was something in their eyes when they heard the name, something that made Emily feel like she had touched on something far bigger than she had realized. She had been too focused on her dad to notice how much of a mystery his life really was. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice from the seat next to her. "Excuse me, young lady, is this seat taken?" Emily turned to find an older man, dressed in a military uniform, standing next to her. He had short-cropped hair, a stern face, and a posture that immediately made her think of someone important. He was calm and collected, his demeanor professional, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made Emily feel a little uneasy. No," Emily replied, moving aside to give him room. "You can sit here." "Thank you," the man said, taking the seat next to her. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, though. Instead, he sat there quietly for a moment, his eyes scanning the cabin. Emily wondered if he was a military officer like her dad. He definitely had the look of someone who was used to being in control. "You're on your way to visit your father, I assume?" the man asked, breaking the silence. Emily nodded, feeling a little nervous. She wasn't sure what to make of him, and she couldn't help but wonder why he was sitting next to her now. She had never seen him before. "Yeah," she said slowly. "He's in the Air Force. He's a pilot." The man smiled, though there was a hint of something else behind his eyes, something Emily couldn't quite place. "Ah, a fellow pilot," he said softly, as though he was thinking out loud. "That explains the mention of Falcon. Quite the name, isn't it?" Emily looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "You know it?" she asked. The man nodded. "I know it. I've heard that name before many times. In fact, I've worked with a Falcon before." He paused for a moment, his gaze distant. "It's not a name you forget easily." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Was he talking about her dad? Was this man actually talking about her dad? Her mind raced with questions, but before she could ask any of them, the man continued, his voice low and serious. "Your father, you see, is no ordinary pilot," he said, his tone shifting. "He's someone who has done things that most people will never even hear about. He's part of something much bigger than what you see on the surface. The Falcon name carries weight, young lady." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to think. The way this man was talking made it sound like her dad was involved in something far beyond what she had imagined. He wasn't just a regular Air Force pilot. He was someone important, someone whose work was shrouded in mystery. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What's my dad really doing?" The man leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "Your father, Emily, is part of a very select group. He flies aircraft that few people know about. He takes part in missions that involve some of the most advanced technology in the world. His work is classified, and it's not the kind of thing you talk about in public." Emily swallowed hard, her mind spinning with the realization that her father wasn't just a regular pilot. He was involved in something much more complex and dangerous. She had never asked him about his work in detail, but now, as she listened to this man, she began to wonder if she had been living in the dark all along. The man sat back in his seat, his gaze still on her. "You might think your dad is just a regular Air Force pilot, but there's a lot more to it than that. The Falcon call sign? It's a symbol of someone who has seen and done things that few others can even imagine. Your father's name isn't just known in the Air Force, it's known by people who work in some of the most secretive parts of the government." Emily's mind raced as she tried to process everything the man had said. She had always admired her dad, but now she realized she knew so little about him. She thought about the stories he had told her, the way he had always been so careful with his words. She had never understood why he kept so many things to himself, but now it was starting to make sense. He had been protecting her, keeping her safe from a world that she wasn't ready to see yet. "You're saying my dad is involved in secret missions?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the cabin, making sure no one else was listening. "Let's just say," he finally said, "that your father's work is vital. It's critical to the safety of the country, and it's not something that can be shared with just anyone." Emily's heart beat faster. She had always known her dad was special, but this was something entirely different. She wondered if he had ever wanted to tell her the truth, if he had ever wanted to share the weight of his secrets with her. But he had never said a word. Now, she was realizing that there was so much more to him than she could ever have imagined. As the plane continued its flight, Emily's thoughts swirled. The world she had known, the world she had thought was simple and predictable, was being turned upside down. Her dad wasn't just a man who flew planes. He was a man who was part of something much bigger, something that no one outside of a small circle could understand. And Emily? She was now a part of it too, whether she was ready or not. The man in the seat next to her gave her one last look, his eyes steady and knowing. "Just remember, Emily," he said softly, "some things are better left in the dark. You don't need to know everything, but you should always be aware. Your father's world is full of secrets, and it's not a world you can walk away from." With that, he stood up, nodding to her as he made his way down the aisle. Emily sat there, staring at the empty seat beside her, her mind racing. She had always wanted to be close to her dad, to understand him, but now she realized that there were things she might never fully understand. And maybe, just maybe, that was for the best. The rest of the flight passed by in a blur. Emily couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with the man in the military uniform. His words echoed in her mind, growing louder with each passing moment. "Your father's world is full of secrets." She wasn't sure what to make of it, but there was no denying that everything she thought she knew about her dad was suddenly called into question. She hadn't realized just how little she knew about his life. Of course, he had told her about the time he spent in the Air Force, the exciting stories about flying jets and meeting other pilots. But those stories were always vague. She never really understood what they meant. Now it all makes sense, she thought, as the realization slowly settled in. Her dad wasn't just a regular pilot. He was someone who had a much more important role to play in the world, a role that required secrecy and distance. Emily was still processing everything when the plane's captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent and should be landing shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed." The words didn't register at first. Emily stared out of the window, watching the ground below become clearer as the plane began to descend. She could see the outlines of cities, fields, and roads stretching out beneath her, but her mind was far from the view. The secrets her father had kept from her, the unknown world that he was a part of, were now all that she could think about. The moment the plane touched down, Emily's heart seemed to skip a beat. She knew it was just the excitement of landing, but there was something else in the air, something that made her feel uneasy. As the plane taxied to the gate, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something important, something she couldn't avoid. The passengers around her began to gather their belongings, but Emily stayed in her seat, frozen in place. She glanced over her shoulder to see if anyone else was still paying attention to her, but the flight attendants were busy helping the others. Her eyes shifted to the man who had spoken to her earlier. He had moved to the front of the plane, speaking quietly with another officer. She couldn't hear their conversation, but the look on their faces said it all. Something was happening. Something that she wasn't supposed to know. The plane finally came to a complete stop, and the captain's voice came through the intercom again, more urgent this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a few moments. We are experiencing a slight delay while we clear the gate." Emily's heart began to race. She could feel the tension in the air, and for the first time she felt like she was truly part of something bigger than herself. She wasn't just a kid anymore. She was connected to her father's world, and that world was full of risks, dangers, and people who operated in the shadows. The door to the plane opened, and the passengers began to disembark. Emily slowly stood up and gathered her things. As she walked toward the aisle, her eyes scanned the cabin, looking for anything unusual. The two men in military uniforms were standing near the front of the plane, speaking with the flight attendants in hushed tones. They didn't look at her, but Emily felt their eyes on her nonetheless. She walked quickly past them, her heart thudding in her chest. When she stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, she was greeted by the usual sounds of travelers. people talking, the announcement of flights, the rolling of suitcases on the tile floor. But to Emily, it all felt distant, almost unreal. She wasn't in the same world she had been just hours ago. Something had shifted, and now she was aware of it. She followed the crowd toward baggage claim, but her steps slowed as she noticed a few people standing off to the side, waiting. There were more military personnel among the crowd, and they didn't look like they were here for a vacation. They were here on business. She tried not to stare, but she couldn't help herself. They were all watching the crowd carefully, scanning each person as if looking for someone. Emily felt a strange sense of unease wash over her. She reached the baggage claim area and spotted her dad's familiar face in the crowd. He was standing there, waiting for her. He waved when he saw her, and Emily's heart lightened for a moment. "Dad!" she called out, rushing toward him. Her dad smiled as she ran into his arms, and for a moment everything felt normal again. The weight of the situation faded just a little. He was there and everything was going to be okay. But then, as she pulled back to look at him, she saw the look in his eyes. Something was different. He looked concerned, almost worried. "Emily, I'm glad you're here," he said, his voice low. "But we need to talk." Emily blinked, confused. "What's going on, Dad? Why are all these people here?" She motioned to the military personnel standing nearby. Her father's face tightened. "It's not safe for you here right now. There are things going on that you don't understand, and I need to protect you." Before Emily could ask any more questions, her father took her by the hand and led her through the airport. The other officers followed closely behind them, keeping their distance but clearly staying alert. Emily's confusion grew, but she didn't protest. She trusted her father even if she didn't fully understand what was happening. They reached a small, private room in the airport, away from the bustling crowds. Her father closed the door behind them and turned to face her. "Emily, I need you to listen to me," he said, his voice stern but filled with care. "You're in more danger than you realize. The people on the plane, the ones who overheard you mention my call sign, they know about you, they know about us." Emily's eyes widened. "What do you mean? Who are they?" Her father took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "They're part of a group that wants to use me for their own purposes. I've been keeping you safe, but now they know you're connected to me. I can't keep you protected forever. This is bigger than just flying jets, Emily. This is about national security, and there are people who will stop at nothing to get what they want." Her mind was spinning. "So those men on the plane, they were dangerous." "Yes," her father said, his voice hardening. "But we don't know how much they know. They could be watching us right now." Emily felt her heart race again. She had no idea what to do with this information. She had always admired her dad, but now she realized just how much he was involved in. The life she had thought was simple and straightforward was full of dangers she had never even imagined. "I'm sorry, Emily," her father said, his voice softening. "I never wanted you to be involved in this, but now that you are, I'm going to protect you. You won't be alone in this, I promise." Emily nodded, trying to absorb everything he was saying. Her dad had always been her hero, but now she understood that his world was far more dangerous than she had ever realized. The door to the room suddenly opened, and one of the military officers stepped inside. "Sir, we have to move. We're not safe here for long." Her father turned to the officer and nodded. "Let's go." He turned to Emily. "We're leaving the airport now. It's going to be okay, but you have to trust me. We have to go quickly." Emily nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She didn't know where they were going or what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: her father was her hero. And no matter what, she was going to stand by him. The car sped down the highway, the tires humming on the smooth asphalt as Emily sat quietly in the backseat, her thoughts a tangled mess. Her father was in the front, his eyes focused on the road ahead, the steady rhythm of the engine echoing in the car's interior. Beside him, one of the officers, Lieutenant Jacobs, glanced back at Emily every now and then, his face serious. The other officers followed in two more vehicles behind them, their presence constant and reassuring. Emily tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had gone from sitting in an ordinary plane seat, staring out at the clouds, to now being whisked away in a convoy of cars with armed military personnel. Everything she thought she knew about her life had just been turned upside down. She had always known that her dad was important, but now she realized just how much. She glanced over at her father. He had always been a man of few words, but today he seemed different. He was tense, alert. His jaw was set and his hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. It wasn't like him to be this on edge. He was always so calm, even in the most difficult situations. But today, there was something more at stake. "Dad," Emily asked quietly, "what exactly is going on?" Her father didn't look at her right away. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, his gaze scanning the rearview mirror before returning to the street ahead. "Emily, I'm sorry you had to find out like this," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But you need to understand you're in danger. The people who were on that plane, the ones who overheard you mention my call sign, they know who you are now. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Emily's heart raced. "What do they want from us? Why are they after you? Why are we being followed?" Her father sighed deeply, his eyes flickering briefly to the rearview mirror again before returning to the road. "It's a long story, one I've never wanted to tell you, but it's time you know the truth. What you overheard back there on the plane was just the beginning. There are people who want to use my position, my skills, for their own purposes. I've spent my career keeping things from getting out of hand, protecting our country. But now they know about you. They know you're my daughter, and they'll do whatever it takes to get to me." Emily stared out of the window, watching the scenery blur as the car sped through the city. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her dad wasn't just a pilot. He was someone who had been involved in things she couldn't even begin to understand. And now she was part of it. She didn't know if she was ready for that. "You're not alone in this, Emily," her father continued, his voice softer now. "I'm going to keep you safe. You won't have to deal with this alone, I promise you." "But what if they come for me?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling with the fear she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. "What if they take me?" Her father's eyes softened as he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "They won't," he said firmly. "As long as I'm here, they won't." The car turned off the main road and onto a smaller, quieter street. The atmosphere inside the vehicle grew more tense as the convoy slowed, the cars moving in close formation. Emily's father's eyes scanned the surroundings, watching every car that passed by. He wasn't just driving, he was observing, making sure they weren't being followed. He knew that they were in a dangerous situation, and every move had to be calculated. They arrived at a small, discreet building at the edge of town, a place Emily had never seen before. It looked like a warehouse with dark windows and a single door. Her father pulled into the parking lot, and the convoy parked behind him. The officers immediately got out of their vehicles, scanning the area. Emily's father opened the door to the car and motioned for her to follow him. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. "We're not safe yet." As Emily followed him, she couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. She had always trusted her dad, always looked up to him, but now she was seeing a side of him she had never known. He was still the same man she admired, but there was a new weight in his actions, a new urgency. Whatever was happening now was much bigger than the stories he used to tell her. The door to the building creaked as they entered, and Emily blinked as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Inside, the space was cold and empty, except for a few pieces of old equipment in the corner and a table covered with maps and papers. The walls were bare and the air smelled faintly of dust and metal. It didn't look like much, but Emily knew this was a place where secrets were kept. Her father turned to one of the officers. "Has the team been briefed?" "Yes, sir," the officer replied. "Everything's in place. We've secured the perimeter. No one's gotten past the checkpoint." "Good," her father said. He turned to Emily, his face softening slightly. "I need you to stay here, Emily. Stay with the officers. Don't leave this room until I get back." "Where are you going?" Emily asked, feeling a sudden sense of panic. Her father hesitated for a moment before answering. "I need to make sure that they're not tracking us. I'm going to check a few things. You'll be safe here, I promise." Emily nodded, but her mind was racing. She wanted to be with him. She wanted to help, to understand what was going on. But her father had always been the one in control, the one who knew what to do. She had to trust him now, even though every part of her wanted to be by his side. As her father walked away, one of the officers moved to stand by the door. The air in the room was heavy with silence. Emily stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. She couldn't escape the fear that was creeping up inside her. What if they were wrong? What if they were being watched, even here? But there was no time for those questions now. She had to trust her father. She had to believe that he was doing everything he could to protect her. Minutes passed in tense silence, each second feeling like an eternity. Emily paced the room, her eyes flicking to the window every few moments. She was starting to feel the weight of the situation, realizing how much danger they were truly in. The life she had once known, the quiet life of a daughter visiting her dad on a plane, seemed so far away now. Suddenly the door opened, and her father stepped back inside, his expression more serious than before. The officers followed him, their faces grim. "We're moving out," her father said quietly. "It's time to go." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on? Are we in more danger?" Her father nodded. "We're not safe here anymore. We need to move quickly, Emily. Stay close to me." The officers quickly packed up the papers on the table, and the group left the building, heading back to the vehicles. Emily didn't know what was happening, but she could feel the urgency in her father's movements. As they drove off again, her father glanced back at her. "Emily, I need you to stay calm. We're going to get through this, but I need you to trust me. We'll figure it out together." She nodded, swallowing her fear. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she trusted her dad. And for now, that was enough. The car sped through the night, the headlights cutting through the dark streets like a sharp knife. Emily sat quietly in the backseat, her heart racing as her father drove. The world outside the windows was a blur, and inside the car, a tense silence hung heavy in the air. The officers, who had been part of their convoy earlier, were now spread out in different vehicles, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. Everyone knew that the situation had escalated. They were no longer just being cautious, they were actively on the run. "Dad, where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice quiet but filled with concern. She had been asking questions all night, but her father had been strangely tight-lipped about their next move. Now, as they rushed through the streets, she could feel the tension growing in her chest. She had always trusted him, but this felt different. Everything felt out of control, and she didn't know what to expect next. Her father glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes calm but filled with a deep, underlying worry. "We're heading to a safe house," he said, his voice steady, though she could tell he was trying to keep the situation under control for her sake. "We'll be safe there, but we need to get there quickly." Emily's mind was spinning. Safe house? What was going on? She had never imagined anything like this happening. Her dad had always kept her sheltered from the dangerous world he lived in. She had never thought about the threats he faced daily. He had always been her hero, strong, confident, and unshakable. But now she could see the cracks. The weight of the situation was starting to show in his eyes. "Who are they, Dad?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people after us, what do they want?" Her father's jaw tightened as he looked ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little more firmly. He didn't answer right away. The silence in the car seemed to stretch on, each second feeling heavier than the last. Finally, he spoke, but his words were careful, measured. "They're part of a network," he said quietly, his voice low. "People who will stop at nothing to get what they want. They've been hunting me for years, trying to get information, trying to use me for their own purposes. I've been keeping you out of it, trying to protect you. But now they know about you, and that changes everything." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her father had always kept secrets, but she never realized how deep those secrets went. She had never known the full extent of the danger he was in. She had never imagined that the man she looked up to, her dad, was involved in something so dangerous, something so dark. "But why me?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Why would they come after me?" Her father's face was hard to read, but there was a flicker of pain in his eyes. "Because you're my daughter," he said simply. "You're the one connection I have to everything I've done, and that makes you a target." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, a truth that Emily wasn't ready to face. She had always been proud of her father's work, proud of what he did for his country, but now she realized that it came at a price. It wasn't just about flying jets or doing dangerous missions. It was about secrecy, betrayal, and the kind of enemies who would do anything to achieve their goals. The car continued to speed down the highway, the hum of the engine the only sound in the vehicle. Emily's mind was racing. She felt a strange mix of fear and awe. She had always thought she knew her dad, but now she was seeing him in a whole new light. He wasn't just the man who told her stories about his flying adventures. He was a man caught in a world of danger, a world that she had never imagined. As they drove, Emily noticed that the city was starting to fade away. The buildings became sparser, the streets quieter. They were leaving the heart of the city behind, heading into more rural areas where they could blend in and remain unnoticed. Her father turned onto a smaller road, one that was barely lit by the few streetlights that dotted the way. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that they were getting farther from civilization, moving into a more isolated place. They finally reached a small, secluded house nestled at the edge of a wooded area. It looked ordinary enough, just a simple two-story house with a few trees surrounding it. But Emily could tell by the way her father moved that it wasn't ordinary. This wasn't just a house. It was a place where secrets were kept. Her father pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. The car was silent once again, but the air felt different now. There was a sense of finality to the moment, like they had reached the point of no return. Emily's father turned to her, his expression soft but serious. "Stay close to me," he said. "We're not out of danger yet, but I promise you I'll keep you safe. No one is going to get to you." Emily nodded, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she trusted her father. He had always kept his promises, and she had to believe that he would do everything in his power to protect her. They got out of the car and walked to the door of the house. One of the officers who had been part of their convoy was already inside, watching the perimeter. He gave them a brief nod as they entered. The house was quiet, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Emily could feel it. Everyone in the room was on edge, waiting for the next move. Her father led her to a small room at the back of the house, away from the windows. It was sparsely furnished with a bed, a chair, and a few personal items, but it felt safe. He motioned for Emily to sit on the bed while he closed the door behind them. "I need you to stay here for now," he said. "I'm going to check in with the others and make sure everything is secure. You'll be safe here." Emily nodded again, but as she sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing. Her life, the life she had known, was slipping away. She was no longer just a daughter visiting her dad. She was part of something much bigger, something much more dangerous. Her father left the room, and Emily was left alone with her thoughts. She couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settling in her stomach. What if they weren't safe here? What if the people after her father found them? She felt a sudden wave of uncertainty crash over her. Just as she was beginning to feel overwhelmed, the door opened again. Her father stepped inside, but this time his expression was different. His eyes were more focused, more determined. "We have to move again," he said, his voice urgent. "It's not safe here anymore." "They found us." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, how?" "They've been tracking us," her father said. "It's time to go, Emily. We need to move now." Her father didn't wait for a response. He grabbed her hand, and they rushed out of the room, moving quickly through the house. The officers were already preparing to leave, checking their gear and making sure everything was ready. Emily could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins as they headed toward the vehicles. This time, there was no time for questions. Emily's father was focused, his eyes scanning their surroundings as they moved quickly toward the cars. She didn't know where they were going next or how they would stay ahead of the people hunting them, but she knew one thing for sure. Her dad was going to do everything he could to protect her, and as long as she was with him, she wasn't afraid.